In 1991, the original crew of the USS Enterprise signed off, literally, with Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, earning critical acclaim and the biggest box office for the franchise since The Wrath of Khan. With Star Trek: The Next Generation ending its successful 7-season run on TV, the time was right to give the Next Generation crew the reins to the big screen franchise. But all involved were wary of making what would be seen as just an extended episode. Thus, the bold move was made to work in none other than Captain James T. Kirk, who would meet his maker in the movie's climax, passing the torch to Patrick Stewart's Jean-Luc Picard. That's right, it's time to tackle Star Trek Generations.
So unnecessary.
To shepherd the Next Generation's move to the big screen, Paramount Pictures decided just to give the reins of the feature film over to the Next Generation producer Rick Berman, who would enlist two of his best writers, Ronald D. Moore and Brandon Braga, to develop the screenplay. Director David Carson, who helmed one of the Next Generation's best episodes, Yesterday's Enterprise, was hired to direct. One had to give the studio credit for allowing the TV gang to craft their own movie, and none of them had much in the way of feature experience. However, many of the Next Generation episodes were considered near feature quality, and the budget, as a concession to the fact that putting the new crew on the big screen would be kind of a risky move, ended up being pretty small, only $25 million, which was a fraction of what most big movies cost at the time.
What's normal?
What's normal? That's a good question.
To help make the Next Generation gang seem feature-worthy, an ace movie cinematographer, John A. Alonzo, who had shot Chinatown and Scarface, was hired, and the sets and models used to showcase the Enterprise D would be totally overhauled. ILM would sign on to do the effects, some of which would include CGI. There had also been a plan to overhaul the uniforms in order to give them a bit of a big screen oomph, but in the end this was abandoned, although some of the uniforms from Deep Space Nine were used as they looked better on the big screen. Apparently, Jonathan Frakes and LeVar Burton actually borrowed theirs from Avery Brooks and Cole Meany, who were roughly the same build. So how did William Shatner end up in the movie?
Excuse me, there will be plenty of time for questions later.
Originally, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy were all supposed to be in it. In the final film, you notice that Kirk is joined by James Doohan's Scotty and Walter Koenig's Chekhov on the maiden voyage of the Enterprise B, where Kirk presumably has his fatal accident. It was supposed to be Spock and McCoy, with Leonard Nimoy turning down the role because it was too minor, while DeForest Kelley, who was in declining health, simply couldn't get insured. In fact, if you watch the movie, it's painfully obvious that all of his dialogue was supposed to go to McCoy, with Chekhov, for some reason, taking over sickbay, despite, not being a doctor. It was obviously supposed to be McCoy, but they just didn't bother to rewrite it.
How big is your medical staff?
The medical staff doesn't arrive till Tuesday.
Who they be till now? You've just become nurses. Let's go.
In fact, Scotty, Chekhov, and even Kirk originally had more screen time, with an opening sequence involving Kirk doing a daredevil skydive being axed at the last minute. In fact, this sequence was present in both the novelization and comic book adaptations, and having read both before I actually saw the movie as a kid, I was kind of confused why this bit didn't end up in the film.
Turn that damn thing off.
In order to give the film a big screen vibe, the cast was kicked up a notch. Whoopi Goldberg, who had shocked the industry by signing on to do the show, around the same time she won an Oscar for Ghost due to her love of Star Trek, returned as Guinan, with a much bigger role than usual.
This is the Nexus.
For you, this is what you wanted.
Malcolm McDowell, a cult icon himself from A Clockwork Orange and Blue Thunder, plus Time After Time and many other movies, secured himself a comeback role starring as the movie's bad guy, Soren.
Actually, I am familiar with history, Captain. And if I'm not too much mistaken, you're dead.
So how does the film fare? It's honestly a mixed bag. Many over the years have said that it feels like a two-part episode, and that's pretty accurate. Paramount was hedging its bets by keeping the film small, although the budget eventually climbed to a still pretty reasonable $35 million, which is about what Star Trek VI cost. But it's also a better movie than some give it credit for. The story is pretty good, with Kirk apparently dying heroically while trying to save the Enterprise B, which was being commanded by the inexperienced Connor Roy. John Harriman, who's played by Alan Ruck.
We don't have a tractor beam.
You left space dock without a tractor beam.
It won't be installed until Tuesday.
The opening has some nice moments with Sulu's daughter at the helm. This was actually supposed to be Sulu himself, by the way, but George Takei didn't want his character to get demoted, as he had been a captain in Star Trek VI.
Sulu, when did he find time for a family?
Well, like you always say, if something's important, you make the time. Ah, so that's why you seem so restless.
The villain, Soren, is very sympathetic to some extent, with him bent on recreating an energy ribbon called the Nexus, which transports people to an idyllic paradise where their dreams come true. He wants to enter the Nexus so he can be reunited with his family who died, although he's willing to kill millions to achieve this.
You've come to dissuade me from my horrific plan. Good luck. Now, if you'll excuse me, Captain, I'm rather busy.
This, of course, puts him on a collision course with Picard, who himself is reeling from a personal tragedy. You see, his brother and nephew, who we were introduced to in the great Star Trek Next Generation episode Family, have been killed in a tragic fire. This is pretty bittersweet given how the brothers reconnected in that famous episode. He ends up being sucked into the Nexus after failing to stop Soren, only to discover that a version of Guinan actually lives in the Nexus, who helps him discover that Captain Kirk actually didn't die in the Enterprise B, but was sucked into the Nexus himself and could possibly help him stop Soren.
You say history considers me dead. Who am I to argue with history?
You're a Starfleet officer. You have a duty.
I don't need to be lectured by you. I was out saving the galaxy when your grandfather was in diapers. Besides which, I think the galaxy owes me one.
Well, it takes some convincing because, Kirk's got his horses and, William Shatner loves horses. He eventually reasons with Kirk, explaining that their ideal shouldn't come at the cost of millions of lives, and Kirk, true to form, helps him stop Soren, dying in the process.
It was fun.
So, why do people not generally like the movie? There are a few reasons. For one, it's definitely paced like a two-part episode, with you having an A story, which is headed by Picard and Kirk, and a B story, which takes place on the Enterprise D and involves the crew tangling with the memorable Klingon villainesses from the show, Lursa and B'Etor. Riker, poor Riker, always got the shaft in these movies, although he did direct a few of them, and his screen time in this is very limited, as is Crusher's and Troy's and Geordi, although at least Geordi gets a cool torture scene. The Enterprise D attack involves the movie's biggest special effect, the separation of the Enterprise's saucer section, leading to a redesign in time for the next big screen Trek movie. A lot of the movie is underbaked, but even in the B story there's some great stuff, with Brent Spiner especially getting a really nice turn as Data, who's been driven half crazy by a new emotion chip that quickly gets out of whack, giving him plenty of opportunity to chew the scenery.
You tiny little life forms. You precious little life forms. Where are you?
One thing worth noting is that the Kirk and Picard matchup is really not one for the ages. The fact is, neither man complements the other well. They have their own style of being captain, and if anything, the movie goes out of its way to serve Kirk, who's the alpha male hero, despite his age. When I was a kid, we watched this movie, we all thought that Kirk was the cool one, and that Picard was, well, to put it mildly, a wimp. At the end, he sacrifices himself to save the day, and Picard comes off as brainy and, yes, again, kinda wimpy. In the next film, First Contact, they would change this, with Picard being turned into an action hero, with Patrick Stewart actually showing off his amazing physique, because the funny thing is, despite everybody thinking that he's really thin and wimpy, Patrick Stewart's always been jacked to the max. Even nowadays, it's still pretty big. In the next movie, First Contact, Picard would, yes, become kind of an action star, taking on the Borg in a much tougher performance that admittedly fared better with folks that saw these movies in theaters.
What we leave behind is not as important as how we've lived. After all, number one, we're only mortal.
Speak for yourself, sir.
In the end, Star Trek Generations, contrary to what some fans may think, was actually a pretty big financial success, grossing $75 million domestically, just about the same as Star Trek VI, and it actually made more money internationally, which convinced Paramount to pump more resources into Star Trek First Contact. One thing that might have hampered the film is that the same people who worked on the show worked on the film.
Oh, shit.
They literally only had days off between the wrap of Star Trek Next Generation and the beginning of Star Trek Generations, so no wonder it felt like an episode. For what it's worth, it's not that bad of a start to the Next Generation's big screen run. But sad to say, with the exception of First Contact, it would wind up actually being a highlight of the Next Generation crew's adventures on the big screen.
I do not understand.
But that's a story for another day.
Got a Farragut. To the beam up.